There's that classic misconception about courage that a brave person is not afraid. In reality, to not experience fear isn't to be brave, it's to be foolish. Being brave is to experience the fear but push past it and continue anyways. And that is the lesson brilliantly shown in Rodin's tribute to the Burgers of Calais.
I feel like who art Ed?
Try to slice it.
Who art it? Mr. Wood art Ed me.
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, where we explore visual arts in an audio medium. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and joining me today, once again, I have friend of the pod and a teacher's teacher, Mr. David Pittman. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here. The more I get to know, I'm excited about this piece today because I've never heard of it, and I can't wait to talk about it.
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about Rodin today. His full name would be Francois Auguste René Rodin, but often referred to just in the shorthand of Rodin. And you probably best know him for The Thinker. I mean, that is like the iconic sculpture. If you know one sculpture in all of art history, it's probably The Thinker or David. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And being a bit of the contrarian, I did not go with The Thinker for this one. I went with the Burgers of Calais, just because that is a piece that is near and dear to my heart, and was really important in like my conception of art history and modernism and what it's all about. So we'll get into all of that a little bit later. Rodin was born November 12th, 1840. He was the second child in a working class family, and I think it's important to understand that because educational opportunities were not the same in that time as they are today. You know, like free public school systems were not always in society, and his education was a little bit kind of dash together what he could learn, where he could learn it. From what I understand, a lot of his early education, he was kind of largely self-taught, and he began drawing around age 10. And then from the ages of 14 to 17, he attended, and I'm sure I'm going to get this wrong, Petite École. Basically, he was at a school that focused on art and math. And I don't think it's going to come as a huge shock when we're talking about a famous artist. He studied art there. He studied primarily painting and drawing there.
Which is actually kind of like when you put it that way of like he was in a working class family. Like even today, if I think about a working class family sending their kid to an art high school is pretty rare. And it's a stretch, to go beyond the public school. And so for this, like, it's even a greater stretch from back then.
I think there's a little truth to that, but I think, one of the popular conceptions that people have is like art is useless, like art is something that we learn if we have the luxury to focus on the finer things. But art was also utilitarian. You think about, especially in that era, like how do you become a skilled craftsman? How do you become, the fabricator for the wallpaper company, or how are you Rodin spent his career in the arts, but not always in the fine arts. He was in what a lot of people would refer to today as maybe the applied arts or the industrial arts. And he was making things for, ornamentation on buildings. He was making embellishments that might go on the roof or above a doorway and stuff like that. When you look at all those old buildings, we talk about that old world craftsmanship. That's what he was doing.
So when he went to his parents and he's like, I want to go to the arts and math school, it was more about like, it could bring in income and like, it's like a practical thing. Whereas today in our modern society, if someone usually goes to their parents and I don't know if it was your experience, but my experience was like, hey, I want to go to study arts. Even if it was the theater arts, it was like, you're going to do what? You're going to like, so it's just, it was like, so it's actually a practical piece. That's actually very interesting because you think, like you said, like art school is like this, well, how are you going to make money? And how are you going in our society today? But back then it was like, oh, that's a good way to make money.
Well, it's a little bit of both, I would say. I mean, in these schools, he was not at Beaux-Arts in Paris. You know, he applied, he was rejected multiple times, but like he was not at the premier like fine arts school. He was studying art, and I think the thing is, like I say, the arts were a practical skill for a lot of people to learn for a lot of jobs in skilled labor and manufacturing and all of that. And he was still, and from what I gather, always enamored with the fine arts. He was painting, he was drawing, he was sculpting, not quite finding his niche yet, though. Because as I said, he went to that school from age 14 to 17, and that was a bit of a impactful experience for him. But it was just helping him to discover some of his raw talents. And I think one of the things I find really interesting is Rodin's teacher, and I am not going to get this right, Horace Lecoq de Boisbaudran. No idea. His teacher, Horace, his teacher at that school, Horace, with a last name I am not going to be able to pronounce. It looks phonetically like Boys Badron, but it's probably like blah. I cannot get any names right. It's Boris. It's Horace.
It's Horace.
His teacher, Horace, was actually he was a skilled artist. And he was teaching, and one of the things that he was doing was very unusual for art education at that time. He would encourage his students to visit the Louvre and study works of art and then draw them. And there's nothing really unusual about that part of it, except what he would do is tell them to draw them from memory. He would say, go look, study, take it in, and then come back to the studio and draw what you remember. And the idea there was, as you are working from your memory of those pieces, it kind of reveals what are you focusing on and what are you drawn to in those pieces. And what he was really doing, which is very progressive for that era, he was encouraging students to find their own voice and to find their own unique lens and their own way of looking at and interpreting these works of art and developing their own style.
I really loved when I read about that. That was when I saw that, I was like, that's a even today, I think that's a piece that we could utilize in even modern education of like having students like not just saying you should memorize this or you should be looking at this, but what do you notice after having left a piece of anything, whether it's art, whether it's of literature or music, what do you remember? And like, that tells you about you. You're right. It's brilliant. It's very progressive.
It really is. Like I say, he was doing that in the 19th century, and I am in some ways doing that kind of thing, or at least going with that mindset and philosophy today. And I think that was really cool. And Rodin, later in his life, after he had found success, he spoke very highly of that teacher and the influence that he had in helping him to develop his style, because Rodin's style did not always meet with the conventions of the time. It was not always what was expected and appreciated early on in his career. And that's why, as I said, he was rejected by Beaux-Arts multiple times. But he persisted. He spent about 2 decades in sort of like we would call the industrial arts or commercial art. He was making decorative embellishments for architecture. From what I understand, he was a lot of stuff with like things that would go on staircases and above door frames and on the roof of buildings and stuff like that. He was very carefully and meticulously crafting those sorts of architectural embellishments. And that's a really difficult thing to do. Like a lot of people don't appreciate, like there's not a lot of margin of error on those things. Like you have to get the symmetry just right on those embellishments, that flair and all of that. And so in that process, as a craftsman, he was really he was really developing that eye for detail and precision work. And that would come up later in his life and in his career. Because in addition to that, like some other influences, like he did for a while consider leaving arts. And it's funny, he tried to join the church, and the priest there, who later went on to become Saint Peter, Julian, and Imard. Last names are really hard.
St. Peter Julian. PJ. St. PJ.
St. Peter told him, like,
not that St. Peter.
You're not great as a priest. You stick with the sculptures. I mean, he wasn't wrong. Like, Rodin went down in history as a great sculptor, but he was kind of trying to make it in other fields and just not finding a lot of success, not finding a lot of traction, but other people did see some potential in him. And so he continued work as a craftsman and studying art. He took more classes under an animal sculptor, Antoine Louis Barret. I feel like I get the first names and the last names elude me. But from that animal sculptor, he was learning about active poses and the movement in the figure and the muscular structure. And again, all of this will come up later, because that's kind of when I think about Rodin's work. What was he doing? He was capturing sort of the physicality of these people. He was also showing a little bit of like the process of the creation. We see some of his marks, and there's this physicality to his sculptures and a sense of movement in their poses, which was different from the standards of the day. At that time, sort of historical pieces were what was prized. You know, like it was the epic, monumental stuff of figures that were larger than life in every way you can interpret that tone. Like, they were not just like physically large and imposing, but they were these idealized forms of the heroic figure. You know, larger than life tales, sort of.
Yeah, and you can really see, I know we'll get to it in a little bit, but like, what you're making me think is those grand postures, like posturing, like posing, or like even if it was an active piece, it was a postured piece, whereas these pieces, like, well, whether it's the one we're talking about today or Thinker, it's these small movements that indicate a very larger, much bigger emotion. Yeah. And it's very interesting because he almost zooms in on a detail in order to zoom out on a greater piece, which is not your monumental, not your grand heroic piece.
Well, because those grand heroic pieces were very staged and carefully arranged to make that figure seem iconic and, you know, grand. And what he was doing was, it's the difference between like your school picture and the snapshot you take with your friends. You know what I mean? Yeah. His stuff was very much like capturing the movement and the gesture in a moment in time. And I think part of that is because his studio practice, and I do not know how he did this, but in his studio, he would tell the models, walk around. I'm going to capture you while you're moving. And like, he did it successfully. Whereas the standard for the day was like, don't you dare move, because I need to capture exactly what you're looking like in this pose. So let's find a pose that you can hold for a sustained period. Whereas what he was doing was much more what we would call like gestural work, where he's just quickly capturing what he sees of the person in motion.
Yeah, that's amazing. I didn't know that like, even for painting, they're usually like sit still, you know, and it's not to think of a sculptor actually telling them to move and picking up on those small details of musculature or of movement in the cloth of their clothing. And I've not heard of that. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, in painting and drawing classes, in our figure study classes, we would often do gesture drawings, which are like these very quick, and I'm talking like a matter of seconds. The longest I've spent on a gesture drawing is like a minute, and we were just trying to capture like the movement and the big pieces, doing the big movements with your arms and capturing what you see very quickly. He was doing the equivalent of that in clay. Which again, like I said, it's a little bit different from certainly the standard practice for the day, and different from what I was learning, well over 100 years later. But the final little bit that I think is really important for understanding his formative experiences and his education and what informed his work and his style is, in 1875, he traveled to Italy for 2 months, and he was just captivated by the work of those like Renaissance artists like Donatello, and in particular Michelangelo. And, he said he was like, Michelangelo sort of helped to free him from like the constraints of the academic mindset and the traditional academic approach to sculpture. And I definitely see that in his work. It feels like a next evolution of the type of thing that Michelangelo was working towards. And around this time, he began working on the Age of Bronze, which was a life-size statue of a male figure. And the thing I find really interesting about this is it's one of those situations that it's a story that feels very contemporary and familiar. There's a little bit of a controversy, and that's how an artist makes a name for themselves. So this work was so good, it brought him attention, but also accusations of cheating, which for me feels a little bit absurd to think of like, what is cheating when you're creating a sculpture? Because you can use any tools that are available to you. Like for me, it feels like the only way to cheat is to put your name on someone else's work. Like, aside from an act of plagiarism, it feels like anything's open-ended, because when we think about, like, if I asked you to draw a straight line, you'd get out a ruler, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Uh-huh. So it's like, where does that boundary come where you feel like, oh, that's too far. That's not enough of the artist's hand.
Right. And that would be to, like, we wouldn't have movements of art. We wouldn't have like those artists who come from a master teacher, and like you can see elements of their pieces, and no one ever is ever like, oh, well, he cheated off of his like, as an apprentice, he just took that style and went with it, so he's cheating. You know, like that. No, we would never say that, and we would never say that. Even if you take it outside of art, and you just like, even if it's movies, or it's even like collective thought about, hey, this is how we're going to be leaders in businesses. And like, we all should like be like more servant leaders. Like, oh no, you're cheating off of that guy. Like, that's like, you're always building upon and not cheating by using somebody else's.
Yeah. And it's like, when I'm working on a portrait of somebody, I take a picture, and then I might use a grid method to break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks, but I'm working from a photographic reference. I don't just transfer the photograph onto the canvas, but honestly, even if I were, I wouldn't necessarily feel like, like when Warhol was making his silk screens, he was using photographic emulsions. And I know historically that's long after the Rodin period that we're talking about, but the accusation of cheating in this was, they said this figure was so realistic, they thought he must have made a cast of a live human being, which, like, is an incredible compliment.
Yeah.
But then you start to think about, like, okay, so a cast of a live human being would be out of bounds. At the same time, what were the standard studio practices for that day? Well, you would have one sculptor, the person whose name we all know, would sculpt something out of clay, and then their studio assistants would take that model and make a larger rendering of it, and then they would cast that and like they would make a plaster cast of it, and then they would, assuming it's all good, they would cast it in bronze or something like that, whatever the ultimate material is going to be. So like making casts of things was already a part of the process. Even having other people's hand in the final work was a part of the process. To me, it feels like kind of an odd line to draw. And again, maybe this is because I came from an educational background where when I was learning sculpture, I was making casts of things, and then I was taking those casts of things and reassembling the pieces. And spoiler alert, that's along the lines of what Rodin was eventually doing, and part of his innovation and part of his mark on history and like modern sculpture. I mean, there's a reason he's considered the founder of modern sculpture. He was using some of those techniques, but he did deny that specific allegation that he made a cast of a live person. It was just a very, very meticulously rendered sculpture. I would think if I were Rodin and I, don't have like primary source documentation to back this up, but just my own speculation, I would wager that was a part of the reason that his later works left a little evidence of process in them. We can see some of his mark making. We can see some of like those thumbprints and stuff a little bit in there. And there's this modern idea of like truth to materials. The idea of like, we're not trying to create a person. We're trying to create a sculpture that represents a person. And so we embrace the artificial elements of it and embrace the process. And he showed the process in his works, especially his most celebrated works do have some evidence of that process. And I would imagine accusations of cheating would probably leave you thinking like, okay, I'm going to make sure that I always leave a thumbprint so people can see like, no, this was something I sculpted,
No, he put a thumbprint on the person and they then cast it so he could just prove.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting.
Yeah. And so I guess now we've kind of gone through the history and what led to his iconic style. I wanted to talk about one of his great works, the Burgers of Calais. This is from 1884 to 1895. Now, I got to say, in my own artistic development, the Burgers of Calais is a piece that really just it stuck with me when I was in like my freshman art history survey course. Like that was the piece that I vividly remember sitting in the lecture hall and hearing the professor explain the story behind it. And it was one where I was captivated by the story, and I spent probably like 2 months after that painting my own version of the Burgers of Calais based on Rodin's sculpture. And it was like the first piece that I felt like I'm okay at painting. It's still not like the greatest painting I've ever made in my life, but it was the first painting where I felt like I'm developing a style that's not terrible. And maybe it's not an accident that I got into this art school. And so it's one that's always been kind of dear to my heart. I guess I'll let you talk about what are you seeing in this piece when you look at it? What jumps out at you?
Well, first of all, I think having the background on what it was about, like what made it so much more impactful. Like, so, as just a guy off the street looking at some sculptures of some dudes, like I did really like, I was drawn to first like the different poses and the 360 of it, the fact that they weren't all facing the same direction or weren't just postured to be kind of facing separate directions, but it was all this immersive piece. And then I was drawn to like the separate emotional states of each individual. And how, like I was saying before, how the gesture that they were doing provoked an image in me of what that emotion would be. And so even the guy that's kind of like scratching his head as he's walking, it's that, that emotion that he's obviously contemplating, and he's he's got something heavy, and just each one of them having their own, just that small little change really opened a lot. And it made it, very, I guess, as I said before, immersive, experience.
Yeah. And I think, the fact that you're able to pick up on those emotions, even through the cold read before you might even know the story behind the piece, I think that's part of what makes it so successful. If you don't know the background, if you don't know who the burgers were, and to be clear, we're not talking about food. Burgers were, it was a title in the medieval system. Like the burgers were sort of people of stature in that society. I do feel like our audience deserves to know the story behind this. So
for sure. I'm
going to share a little bit here. The Burgers of Calais is inspired by the story of the people during the 100 Years' War. It was a war between England and France. Edward III of England basically went after Calais, France, after he had a victory in the Battle of Crécy. The year we're talking about here is 1346, so quite a while back. And Philip VI of France told the people of Calais, you've got to hold out at all costs. If England were coming into France, like Calais would be the city they would try to land in. It's relatively close to the island. It would be a good strategic point for them to have control over. In World War II, Calais was a place they considered the Allies making the run at the continent at the same time that the Normandy invasion was happening. You know what I'm saying? So, Calais was kind of an important place strategically. King of France is saying, you guys got to hold out. This siege is going to be rough, but you're too important. We can't lose this city. But Philip wasn't able to break the siege, and the people were starving. And so eventually they have this parley, and they're trying to negotiate a surrender. Edward III offered to spare the people of Calais if they would give up 6 of the town leaders. And so it's this heart-wrenching situation where the people who were of the the higher nobility, the higher society, the titled people in the town realized they had to be willing to sacrifice themselves to save their friends and neighbors and to save numerous other people. And so one of the wealthiest of the town's leaders, Eustace de Saint Pierre, another name I cannot pronounce, he was the first to volunteer. He stood up and said, I will go. And then 5 burghers, like I said, medieval title holders, they were leaders in the community. They joined behind him. And to give an idea of just like how bleak things looked for them, the 6 of them were told to come out with ropes around their necks and holding the keys to the city and the castle. Everybody was assuming that those 6 people were walking off to be executed. Fortunately, England's queen, Philippa de Hainault, she convinced Edward to show some mercy and spare the men from execution. She was expecting a child, and she believed like their deaths would be a bad omen. I mean, they weren't necessarily talking about karma in Europe in the 14th century, but it's that same kind of idea. She was just like, we can't be doing something so monstrous. It's going to come back to bite us. And so they were spared. But what Rodin created in his Burgers of Calais statue was a sculpture of all 6 of those figures. And he shows that brave, heroic first person to volunteer and say, I will sacrifice myself. I will do this for the good of the community. But he also shows like the terror, the range of emotions those people were feeling, even though they were doing something that was noble and for the good of other people, it was still a gut-wrenching situation. And he shows that whole scope of emotions. And that's why people hated it when he presented it.
They did.
It was not like, there were some people who got it and saw it as like, as this beautiful and important work of art. But again, what people were expecting at that time was one grand figure, the hero of the piece, a monument to Saint Pierre, who sacrificed himself and led the charge to do what needed to be done to save the town. And
so I'm guessing that's the guy in the picture that we're both looking at. But I did do some homework and looked at some other, scopes of it. Is that the guy that's like standing? I'm assuming with like his hands down and his face very stoic, looking out.
He's stoic. His chest feels a little bit like his posture seems strong.
Yeah.
Whereas you see other people who feel like they're almost cowering. They're not quite being dragged out there, but you can see they're not happily going out there. I mean, nobody's really happily going out there, but there is that range of like some people just like, this is the sacrifice I'm going to make and I'm going to go nobly. And some people who like the reality is setting in on what this fate is going to be for them. Not to get too dark on it, but like that's the mindset that those figures were in. And Rodin is trying to be true to that moment rather than trying to build up sort of a myth of that one noble, heroic figure who saves the day. He's trying to show what the real stakes were and the sacrifice and what that really meant for those people who are willing to make that sacrifice.
Well, even what I loved it too about it, I was able to find a kind of one that you could like 360, look around. But like, there's the one gentleman who's, what was his name? Saint Pierre.
Yeah, I cannot get it for this one. It's the first name. It's Eustache de Saint Pierre.
Him. Yeah. That guy. He's there, but then we have like actual interaction between the two people. We have another in the back, a guy kind of like with his arm on the shoulder of another, and it's just they're all so experiencing this collective piece, and it's amazing that you have, if you just zoomed in on what's his name, Saint Pierre.
Yeah.
You would kind of get that like kind of one monumental kind of person, but the clothing, the shackles, the ropes would take away from that. But then to see the interaction of all the other burgers that are there is something. And even the one behind him is the one that's the like most grieved with the hands over the head. That you have that juxtaposition right there is pretty brilliant as well.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's one of the things that can easily be lost is that when you show the full scope of emotions, that strength of that first volunteer, it shines through because of the contrast that's immediately apparent. If you just made a sculpture of the one man standing tall with his chest puffed out, like, yes, he's going to look strong and heroic, but you don't fully understand the stakes and how his conduct differs from other people and the expectations of the time and all of that sort of stuff. I think, like I said, it was one of those pieces that for me just really resonated because of that idea of showing the authentic emotion and the true stakes involved in something and the human impact of the drama. It's not just like this story from history. It's a story that played out with real people who had real feelings. And that's kind of always been central to my own development and my own understanding of art history and, who are the people and what are the stories behind it? What makes it matter? And I think Rodin showed us that in a way that no one else at that time was.
Yeah, for real. And I think too, like you see those evidences of his background, like all of the things that came into from what he learned into this piece. So you've got that, what you remember is what you pay attention to style of he's able to like almost make you figure out what you're going to pay attention to. And like, so he's looking into the hyper detail of things and not just the overall essence of it. And then the musculature too is really, fine tuned in the arms and in the facial structures and all of that, and in the turn of their neck. And then the embellishments that he learned from the work he did in terms of the doorways and stairways and all of that is in the clothing and in the ropes and such of their wardrobes. And so I just think like it's awesome that you can see so much of that all come together into one piece.
Yeah, it definitely feels like something that it would take a lifetime to become mature enough to capture all of that in such a sophisticated way.
Mm-hmm. I'm wrapping it up. I want just a 3-point rating scale. And where should this hang? The Louvre? Is this something to look at? The lab? Is this something to learn from? Or the Louvre? British for the bathroom.
Yeah, there's a
the
poop joke in there somewhere.
Oh, that's terrible.
Okay, because I did see like that they had put it. Is it Stanford? Maybe it was just on the website. But I didn't know if it was like on their campus or something, like a reproduction of it or whatever. But it really, truly, like, it truly does belong in a monument in a place where, like, I can't put it outside of that because it's so interactive and real, and you've got to be able to interact with it. Like, it should be somewhere where people can walk in between and among them, and it. More than any other monument belongs to be a monument. This belongs to because like the fakeness of some monuments that are just blah, like they're just standing there, like they're there for the high school picture is like, but this really is like a capturing of a moment. So it's difficult for me to like put it somewhere else other than in a public place where people could walk among it and remember what happened.
Yeah. It feels like it should be in the public square. It should be out there. For me, the closest is like the museum, but it should be like it feels like a museum piece to me in the sense that it is like so important about the development of art and art history, the development of like humanity and culture and society. Like this is memorializing not necessarily like, oh, the Battle of Calais between England and France in like 1340s was so important on the history of the world, but it's just like that idea of like what people did and what people endured. I think that's important for us to understand when we understand history is like the human impact of all of these things that we read about. And so for me, it's like it's a museum piece for the ages because it makes that history and it makes larger events make sense on the human scale. But I feel like it also belongs outside of the museum. Like you were saying, it belongs out where people will see it, will encounter it, will contemplate it. And so, I would say in the town square is where I ultimately land with it. Even though it's kind of a downer.
Yeah, no, but it also isn't though, right? Of like, I was just thinking when you were saying that about what it represents, like you said, like it's not this big battle. This like that we like, the world changed because of Calais and the burgers that gave up. But it symbolizes both sacrifice and it symbolizes grace because it was like they're going to give up their lives. But then you also know the rest of the story, which is they were spared. And so, it's just like that. Like, what are you willing to do for your fellow human? Yeah. Humankind. Why it can speak beyond just, you could put it in any town place, and if they knew the story, they would be able to sit and contemplate the different emotions and different pieces that are there.
Yeah, I think that's true. And so I think that's a good place to wrap it up on.
Thanks, Rodin.
Thank you, Rodin, for showing it to us. And thank you, David, for taking the time to come talk with me. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure. Oh, I always love it. I always learn so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted. If you found this tolerable, please like and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week in the show notes, on Twitter at WoodArtEd, and on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.